Okay, I think it's 3 past, so I think we're gonna we're gonna start. So, hello everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Dr. Sara Gonzalez, and I'm an associate professor in the in human critical geography at the School of Geography. I'm also associate director at the Global Food Environment Institute. Just very recently joined in. And it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual seminar of the Global Food and Environment Institute. And today we're going to have a talk by Dr. Asa Roast, which is titled Urban Agriculture as Wasteland Commons, Exploring the Ecological and Economic Limits of Urban Agriculture Through Wasteland Farming in Southwest China. Very long title, Asa. That was quite good to read. And Asa is a teaching fellow in human geography, so he's a colleague of mine at the School of Geography. It's worth saying that, Asa comes from a human geography background. He is an urban geographer and also an ethnographer with a focus on urbanization in contemporary China. He came to geography through a different, perhaps not a very typical path. He completed an undergraduate degree in history, and he studied MA in China Studies at SOAS at University of London, followed by MA in Social and Cultural Geography at the University of Leeds, where he then stayed to complete his PhD. Actually, one of his supervisors is also in the call, Paul Whaley. And during this time, during his PhD, the PhD took a bit longer because he actually spent quite a long time in China. He also took some time to learn the language. He spent 20 months doing fieldwork in Chongqing, Southwest China. And during that time, he was actually visiting research at the Southwest University School of Geographical Sciences. So we're going to hear more about how he conducted his research as well, his methods, which are of interest to him as well. But it's fair to say, I think, Asa, that perhaps generally your food is not generally your focus. So this is an interesting, I think it's really interesting to present to this audience, because you might get quite different feedback and ideas. And perhaps I think I forgot to ask you before, if you can tell us, I know this is part of your PhD, you can tell us a bit more about where this is going, if it's already been sent to publication or not, and that would be useful in terms of people giving you feedback. So I just got couple of more things to say, and then I'll pass on to Asa. So just a bit more information about the Global Food and Environment Institute, for those of you who haven't been to one of the seminars before. It's an interdisciplinary research community here at the University of Leeds, which brings together members from across academia, industry, and public policy to work on the integrated challenges of food security and climate change. So it's a really big group of academics across the university. We've got different themes. In particular, I'm more involved in the urban food systems. And I think also this talk today relates more to that theme of the urban food systems. Already in the chat, there's been some post about some few links to more information about our institute. So please check those, and also follow us on Twitter, and feel free to tweet about this event as it's happening. And there's more seminars. This seminar is part of a series, so please check as well in the chat function with a link to our series advertised on Eventbrite. So just one more thing in terms of seminar etiquette, we're going to keep our cameras and microphones switched off so that we have as much bandwidth as possible. The presentation will take about 20 minutes, and you're welcome to ask questions during the presentation, but I think to keep things, not to distract Asa will just be doing his presentation for 20 minutes. I will keep an eye on the chat and the questions, and so, we won't interrupt Asa during his presentation. I will then sort of collate and field some of the questions, and we'll have 10 minutes for questions and answers. And hopefully, as you realize, the seminar is being recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube later on. Okay, so that's great. I think I finished my bit. So over to you, Asa.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Okay, so by way of introducing this research, it's great to be here virtually in the Global Food and Environment Institute. And I do need to start with something of confession, as Sarah was saying, although I'm now presenting this work for an audience of food researchers and environmental scientists, including some colleagues from geography and other social sciences. This is not my disciplinary background at all. I'm an urban geographer, critical urban geographer, meaning that I'm principally interested in questions of social practice, housing, informality, political economy, and it's really quite by accident that I came to be doing research about urban agriculture. So the article which this presentation is based upon is forthcoming in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, and I see its main contributions as being to the fields covered by that journal, urban theory and an empirical study of urbanization and informality in China. A little bit different from, focusing on urban agriculture as such. And I don't consider myself, a geographer of urban agriculture as such. I'm rather kind of integrating this into a broader network of study. So we need some theoretical context to understand how I'm framing my research field then. So one of the questions that I brought with me when I began conducting fieldwork in 2015 was what exactly it is that an urban geographer studies. That is, what is urban? What does it mean to be urban? So over the last 10 years or so in urban studies, this has been a topic of some debate, led by conversations around planetary urbanization. And the planetary urbanization thesis put forward by Brenner and Schmidt argues in brief that the conceptual tools which we have used to think about the human environment are now outdated and no longer suited to describe the empirical world around us. Foremost amongst them, they say, the distinction between urban and rural. They argue that the idea of the city, which when it arose in urban sociology in the early part of the 20th century as an object of study, was defined largely by what it was not, by its difference to the agrarian countryside. They argue this conception of the city is no longer a meaningful analytical category in the 21st century. As we have seen, urban systems of production, industry, pollution, and infrastructure reconfigure much of the planet far beyond the boundaries of built-up human settlements that we would kind of traditionally think about as sites of the urban. So instead, Brenner and Schmidt contend that urbanization is now a process much bigger than the city itself, and so must be understood beyond a dualism between that which is inside and outside of the city. And it's worth noting there has also been significant pushback or debate about this, the utility of this thesis by other geographers who seek to emphasize the social ontology of the urban, and I think this is really valuable. What that means is that we must understand that the urban is a social field which makes and is made by social actors, and so is also a field of contestation and praxis, and not just an inevitable outcome of global capitalism or an overdetermined destination. So we can take that kind of theoretical debate and move a little more concrete with it. If we want to look at the ways in which people and spaces become urban, one of the more concrete ways in which we can do this is to look at the relationship between urban life and agriculture. So as I mentioned, traditionally urban theory has viewed agriculture as a constitutive outside of the urban, meaning that the city was partly defined by its difference from and incompatibility with agricultural food production and ways of life closely associated with the land. And this is one of the reasons why recent scholarship on urban agriculture has tended to understand it as an alternative way of life which exists in opposition to some of the typical trends associated with urbanization. So in particular, research on urban agriculture, as I've encountered it, tends to view it as a space and social practice which is ecologically and economically outside of, different to the city, and it's a practice which then allows its practitioners a degree of autonomy from a set of systems and infrastructures which would otherwise be disempowering, alienating, and exploitative of their life in the city, a system we might call capitalism. So urban agriculture then is viewed as being ecologically outside of the city, insofar as it allows urban residents to overcome alienation from the land, and from ecological systems associated with rural ways of life. And it's also viewed as being economically outside of the city, insofar as urban agriculture is usually associated with the non-commercial production of food, the decommodification and sharing of land and natural resources, in opposition to the privatization and dispossession of space and of foodways, of vegetables, which we generally see as part of the process of urbanization and urban food systems. And this is where the idea of the commons comes in, the commons as a non-regulated public good that urban agriculture can provide, a non-regulated site where people can produce goods outside of the market. So a key point that I'm drawing on here, though, is also that we must be cautious about understanding, even here, this is a neat dichotomy between that which is rural and that which is urban. I'm drawing here on the work of Angelo, which has warned about the risks of romanticizing or generalizing about the appearance in urban settings of phenomena we would generally associate with the rural, such as agriculture. So Angelo's work emphasizes the need to avoid romanticizing and assuming that phenomena like urban agriculture, which we would typically associate with spaces outside of the city, is necessarily kind of a sign of, a hangover from a rural past or something like this. Okay, so we can move more concrete still. This is the actual space that I'll be talking about today. So this is a space which I refer to in this article as the Kongdi, which is a Mandarin Chinese term meaning empty land or perhaps wasteland. The Kongdi, which is the term that the people who were using this land called it by. And what we're looking at here is space which was previously rural land, which about 20 years ago was part of the agricultural countryside, which then underwent expropriation by the local states and was urbanized around a decade ago. And as you can see here, it's kind of hemmed in by the city on one side, and indeed there is kind of built up urban areas all around this space. Yet this particular space has not yet been built upon. And so what we see here is a practice of informal agriculture and construction by residents living nearby. And it's really important to emphasize that this is entirely informal. This is a process of growing vegetables and making use of this land, which takes place kind of semi-legally, illegally, with no rights to this land. And it takes place without any kind of organization. There is no local government which says this is okay. There is no local residents committee that organize and distribute the land amongst the people who want to use it. And there is no outside activists or NGOs encouraging this use of the land. This is entirely kind of spontaneous and autonomous use of this land by local residents. We can provide a bit more context here. So this space, the Kongdi that I'm talking about, is in the city of Chongqing in southwest China, where I did my doctoral research. And this is a city that has seen very rapid state-led growth since the early 2000s. This GIF that I included here, which shows the expansion of the city from about 1990 to 2018, which quite nicely illustrates some of the ideas behind the planetary urbanization thesis about the extension of urban systems beyond the city itself. And in Chongqing, this has been a process of state-led expropriation of rural land, the state purchasing or expropriating rural land from villages, providing some compensation for that land, then effectively banking that land, sitting on it for a period of time while its market value increased, then finally privatizing that land through the lease of its use rights to private developers. And what this has created in this kind of band around Chongqing is a variegated peri-urban landscape where we see in side by side to each other state-built housing, which houses displaced residents from the urbanization of the countryside and from the transformation of the city center, along with migrants who have come from elsewhere in China to Chongqing. We see the increasing manufacturing concerns, manufacturing for global consumption. If you're watching this presentation on an HP laptop, it was probably made in this area in Chongqing. We see also the rise of private luxury housing in this peri-urban area as house prices increase and it becomes increasingly profitable for developers to build luxury housing. But we also see a large amount of land, such as the Congdi, which has been formally urbanized, but not yet built upon. So that's an important point here, that while I'm talking about one specific space, this is a type of land which is very common in the peri-urban region of Chongqing. I could have chosen many different examples, but I chose to focus on this one particular space. And indeed, you can find very similar spaces in the vast majority of Chinese cities. So the methods I used to study this space then, I was doing ethnographic fieldwork in Chongqing from November 2015 to June 2017. And initially I was interested in questions of the kind of social transition that this urbanization on the edge of the city had provoked. And so I was looking at housing, I was looking at the conditions of people living in this high-rise public housing on the edge of the city. And as I was doing interviews with them or spending time with them, I noticed how for many of them, for several of them, the use of this idle land next to the public housing was really central to how they'd kind of managed their transition to the city. And so this is how I came to, quite by accident, be doing research on urban agriculture, from initially looking at the housing, the kind of high-rise housing where this photo was taken, to then moving to this vacant land to look at the kind of agricultural practices taking place there. And so my work consisted of interviews with local officials in the area, residents nearby, but also property developers and archival research in Chongqing itself. So the land we're looking at here then is about 75,000 square meters of Congdi, of wasteland in Yubei district on the northern edge of Chongqing. Originally, this had been part of Shiliangqiao village, which was demolished and expropriated by the local state in 2004. Then in 2012, this plot of land was purchased by a private developer for about 2,000 yuan per square meter, which is significantly more than the compensation that would have been awarded to the original farmers of this land. So this is a space which has already been urbanized, but which is not subject to any formal management or control by local government. It was not a space where the local government viewed it is their responsibility to police the management of the land or to prevent people from using the land as they saw fit. So the concrete research which I did in this wasteland, this Congdi then, was a process of kind of a survey and mapping combined with some interviews, talking to the farmers of 36 different plots within the Congdi. This is largely used by, as I was saying, people who've been displaced to the edge of the city, but there was a distinction here between the locals and the outsiders. So the locals who have their plots highlighted in blue here were people who had originally lived in this land prior to urbanization. They'd been urbanized about a decade before. They had an average age of 62, and they tended to have used these individual plots for longer. Counterposed to them, there were also outsiders making use of this land. These were largely incoming migrant workers who had come from elsewhere in China to Chongqing, who were younger on average, were majority female, and who tended to combine this work, the work in the fields, with work in factories or other forms of kind of casual labor on the edge of the city. And this is a really interesting point, first of all, just that this is not, it kind of illustrates quite nicely this point that the continued use of this land is not just, it's not just a continuation of a rural past. It is different people now making use of this land, people who would not be here if it wasn't for the broader processes of urbanization that had brought them to this particular bit of Chongqing. I then looked in more detail at the kind of ecological relationship that was brought into being by their farming of this land. So what we saw in the Chongqing was really sophisticated farming techniques that showed the investment of a great deal of time and attention into this space, even though it was essentially a wasteland to which they had no formal right to use. There were many farmers who were engaged in organic composting, who were very proud about the organic status of the vegetables they grew. There were irrigation systems that had been built and used by various of the plot users, sheds and chicken coops that had been constructed, some more kind of compounds almost that had been constructed on this land. But the farmers were also making use of urban ecological flows as they farmed this space. For instance, to supply irrigation to some of this land, they tapped into urban water mains that had been built in the last few years as part of the urbanization of the area. And they had an improvised latrine on the edge of the space, which was accessible from the street outside. So urban residents walking past would make use of this latrine, and it would provide them with a source of sewage, of compost that they could then fertilize their crops with. Simultaneous to this, there was a perception by the farmers, by many of the outsider farmers in particular, that they were escaping the polluted foodways of the city, that it was somehow more bodily healthful to be engaged in farming yourself, and that they could then guarantee the organic nature and the healthy nature of the vegetables they were growing on this land in a way that they wouldn't be able to guarantee if they were buying vegetables in the supermarket or making use of urban food systems. And in contrast to that, I also spoke to local land users who had been here for a longer period of time, who viewed the land as extremely polluted in contrast to how it had been prior to urbanization. So there's interesting construction of it as both polluted and non-polluted. And then I was also really interested in the economic constitution of the Chongqing, and whether it could be described as a commons, this idea of a space which is an unregulated public good, where these people are making use of land without any governance structures. So there was a conceptualization of ownership of these plots of lands. People understood that they had rights to use particular plots of land, but this right, this ownership, was based upon the fact that they had made productive use of the land, and that they had taken over land which had previously been idle, that they had opened up the wasteland, cleared stones, and made productive use of it. And this gave them the right to continue to use the land. There was a lot of sharing of resources and knowledge between locals and outsiders, people who talked about learning a great deal about how to farm vegetables from their neighboring farmers. But in contrast to this kind of, I don't know, almost utopian image of this use of the land, we also saw the imposition of urban land values onto this land in the form of certain farmers within the space explicitly holding on to plots of land because they were expecting further monetary compensation when this land was eventually built upon. That is, many of the local land users would say, we don't actually care about growing vegetables here. We are growing vegetables here principally so that when a developer finally comes to build on this land, we can demand some compensation from them. And indeed, shortly after my fieldwork finished in 2018, a developer did arrive, and the Chongqing was finally bulldozed and built upon. And I'm conceptualizing this as, in the article, as a politics of anticipation, drawing on the work of Abdul-Malik Simone, anticipating the temporary use and expected enclosure of this land by the city. So just really quickly, because I know I'm short on time, run through some conclusions. So in the published version of this paper, I suggest that Chongqing offers us a novel category of space in planetary urbanization, a definition of the Chongqing as a category of space which lies outside of formal urban management, is subject to autonomous but temporary use in ways distinct from the urban, and through which the limits of the urban are themselves negotiated. The specific contours of urban agriculture in the Chongqing illustrate the uneven production of planetary urbanization. against the extensive restructuring of space, dispossession and commodification of rural land, which underpins the expansion of Chongqing, the expansion of the city, the delayed development of the Kongdi allowed a space for nominally rural practices of food production and common land use to emerge. But more detailed investigation of these practices revealed how they remained ecologically and economically firmly entangled with urban systems. But it's important to note that these practices of urban agriculture were nonetheless perceived by the users of the space as offering a zone, constituting a zone which is at least partially outside of the disempowerment and exploitation that they would otherwise face in the city. And it's then a space through which their own experience of becoming urban could be negotiated. I want to also highlight here that this is the conventional notion that agriculture and urbanization are incompatible and mutually exclusive outsides is complicated by the social reality of this space, which is not simply a remnant of the rural past or a space which is in opposition to urbanization. Rather, it is definitively an urbanized space, and it shows how agricultural production of food can be closely enmeshed within urban ecologies and economies, even without any kind of formal organization. This is also why I suggest we shouldn't think of this space as an urban commons as such, because the more common natures of its economy were undercut by the fact that it was facing very rapid enclosure. It's a peri-urban commons, which is defined by the prospect of its own rapid enclosure. And just finally, very briefly, I want to offer some thoughts about where this research could be taken next, which might link up with some of the research interests of people in the audience. Because my research here finished in 2017, and since then I've been unable to return to do follow-up research at this site, initially because I was finishing my PhD and then due to COVID. But the directions that I'm interested in taking this research in next, one aspect would be to look at the kind of cultural value of urban agriculture in China, how it's perceived as a site of informality, perceived as a topic of governance, but then also increasingly used as a tactic of regeneration. And ironically, some of those luxury housing estates which were built on this land did market themselves partly on the basis that it would be a more rural way of life and that there would be shared vegetable gardens there. Another aspect that would be really interesting to dig into would be to look at the kind of hard science of these spaces, look at the soil quality, the ecology of these lands and the pollution that impacts them. There's some interesting work already being done in that area that I can talk about. And the other aspect that I'd be really interested in is mapping the scale and the scope of informal urban agriculture in Chinese cities, because as I was saying, this is definitely not a unique space, but a space which is extremely common in many cities in China. So understanding the extent of this use of land and the broader economics of it would also be very interesting. I've talked a bit too long there, so I'll stop now. Oh, and that's finally the title of the paper when it's published and the references here.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Asa. I think we're good on time. We've still got some time for questions. So please put your questions in the chat, questions of any nature. There's more information about the fieldwork or the site or in a more theoretical. So there's already a couple of questions coming, so I'm gonna read them out for you, Asa, because so far we got two, so I think it's all right to read them out, and then perhaps I'll do two, and then you can think about those together, and then that gives some time to people to start putting more questions up. So the first question from Justin Pickard, picking up on users' anticipation of temporary use. Can you say more about how this expectation enabled or not particular practices? And didn't you find anyone challenging or contesting that as an assumption? I guess contesting the temporary use, contesting that as an assumption.
Yeah.
And then I'll just read another one by Steve Banwood. Do you have a sense of the attitudes of those dwelling in the built housing nearby? For example, is it the informal land use welcomed? Is there a scope and value in building such land use into the eventual planning of development and enclosure. So yeah, so how is it viewed by the residents of the area, and whether even that could be, that those uses have already been even incorporated in further development. So that's 2 questions for now.
Great.
You keep them coming.
Yeah, so Justin's question about, the politics of anticipation, it's really, really interesting. So this was all based around, unfortunately, due to the kind of timing of my fieldwork, unfortunately, it's a horrible way to put it, but I wasn't around to see, the eventual demise of this space. So I don't know the politics of what actually played out in this space after my fieldwork. But the expectation amongst the people who were making use of this land was that when a property developer came to eventually build on this land, they would provide some monetary compensation, but that this would only be provided to those residents who were original inhabitants of the land, that is the local users of this land, and that this would not be, there would be no monetary compensation for those outsiders who had arrived from elsewhere in China and were making use of this land. And that did lead to a degree of, kind of conflict, nothing kind of openly not kind of violent conflict or anything like this, but a degree of animosity within the land users. There was one interview I did with a woman who was a migrant worker from elsewhere in China, who described how she'd spent a long time clearing a bit of land in the wasteland and cultivating it and planting crops and stuff like this. And then somebody from the urbanized local villagers came along and said, this used to be my land. I have the right to farm this land. And basically kind of kicked her off the plot. And she said, there's nothing we can do about this. Obviously, there's no kind of police you could go to, but there was a general expectation that the locals could extract, that monetary value from the land in a way that the outsiders couldn't. And then the question of kind of contesting the temporary land use is really interesting. It was this maybe kind of ties into Steve's question too, but it was always, the people who I spoke to always expected that this land would be demolished in the near future. And indeed, they often, as a foreigner walking through this plot, they would often assume I was from a property developer, come there to kind of do a survey before it eventually got demolished. And there was, when I tried to steer conversations or ask questions in a direction towards, wouldn't you like to see this space stick around more long term? Where will you go and find land after this to farm? What will you do if you lose access to this land? There was never a belief that there was any alternative to this land being removed. It was always accepted that this land is going to be gone. We're not going to be able to use it anymore in the near future. And expectations that they'd be able to find some other bits of land somewhere else in the future, which obviously will eventually kind of run out. And that relates to, Steve's question about the attitudes of those people dwelling there. So the interesting thing here, one thing to say is that, so a lot of the people dwelling in those high-rise buildings around there are the people doing the farming. And in some cases, there were even, local officials, members of the local Communist Party, who were doing the farming themselves and who said, this isn't something that we can be proud of in this area, but there's no harm in people making temporary use of this land, precisely because it is temporary. And in their understanding, in the understanding of most people who I spoke to, they had very much this kind of modernist understanding of how this land was progressing, and understood that the fact that people are still using the land to farm, it's kind of an embarrassing hangover from the past. It's a symbol of how this city is not yet fully modernized, how it's still backwards in some way, and that this will be removed, cleaned up in the near future. I think absolutely I think it would be a really, it's the direction that I'd like to take this research in, is to find a way to kind of advocate for the value of these kinds of spaces, albeit temporary, and how that kind of communal space or space for unstructured use of land for farming could be factored into future developments. But I think, I mean, within the current political economy of urbanization in these places, the prospect for that is not hugely hopeful.
Asa, I'm going to stop you there, sorry.
Yeah.
Because there's two more questions, and I know that obviously you know so much about this whole research. Two more questions, one from Leif Johnson. I hope I pronounced that right. It's a question about food. Could you talk a bit more about the food that was produced? How much sold, or was it used for home consumption? Also wonder how individuals, users chose or valued specific pieces of land, if there was other land nearby, or there was a assumption of a scarcity. And then we have a question from Paul Whaley. A lot of the factors that condition the nature of the Chongqing and the urban agriculture that is practiced there is particular to China, but do you see parallels or lessons or practice transfer for other cities or countries, perhaps in Southeast Asia or Africa? So two very different questions. And I'm not sure we got any more time for them, but if you have other questions, I'm sure you can put them up there, and maybe Asa can get back to you. Or
yeah, definitely.
But yeah, just put them up
email.
there, even though we might run out of time.
Yeah. Yeah. So Leif, the question about food. I want to just list all the vegetables that were being grown there. So we had aubergine, potato, chili. We had artsai, which is like a brassica that was grown there, which I've managed to buy seeds for online. It's kind of a Sichuanese brassica, which I'm now growing in my garden. So taking a little bit of.
How's it going there? Is it sprouted?
Yeah. And yeah, the use of this food then, most people said that they were eating most of it, eating themselves, selling what they could sell otherwise. There was a dedicated market space set up as part of the urbanization where people could go and sell veg that they'd grown themselves, or sell, small scale veg holdings, because people were also growing veg in their rooftops and other spaces and stuff like this. But most of the people who I spoke to in the Chongqing didn't use those spaces because they said nobody ever passes through there. So they'd set up outside subway stations or in the compounds of these residential districts and sell to people passing by there. A lot of the recurring theme was about the healthiness of growing your own vegetables, especially if you're looking after young children. So the common pattern for a lot of people was that it was grandparents who were doing the farming because they had the time to do so, then feeding vegetables to their grandchildren. And Paul's question about, the wider implications of this. I mean, I think this is another direction to take the research in. I think obviously there's crossovers with theories of extended urbanization in a lot of the global south, as we've talked about, the crossovers with Desakota in Southeast Asia. I think, that it would be really fascinating to be able to do some kind of comparative study at these spaces of informal agriculture between, say, a city in Africa, a city in Southeast Asia, and a city in China, to look at the different politics and the different economies at play there. I think there's absolutely scope for that kind of research.
So Steve's come back to you, and that sounds like a really interesting potential future research, because I think he's got experience of maybe urban agriculture being seen slightly differently in other parts of rapidly urbanizing China. So that's really, another question, perhaps we can just quickly answer. Am I right in understanding that all of the users had previously been farmers, whether local or outsiders? No urban allotment holders?
Yeah, so not quite. There were a few people who had been originally grown up in the center of the city, who had been kind of displaced by the regeneration of the city center to the edge of the city, who talked about learning to farm there, and who had kind of taken over some of the use of this land. Although they tended to be, the main person I talked to wasn't so much a farmer. He did a little bit of farming, but he had like a smokehouse where he'd smoke meat on the Chongqing. So that did include, originally urban residents who were picking up a bit of farming by virtue of having the space to do so on the edge of the city. Oh, you're muted, Sarah.
We'll probably leave it there, but just to look out for this paper, which is coming out soon.
Yeah, I've done the proof, so it should be any time now.
Right, so look out for this paper for, oh, thanks, Alex, for more information and some very, very potentially interesting kind of future ideas there, for perhaps comparing as well with other parts of China as well. And so, yeah, thanks again. Check out all the seminars that are happening during the, yeah, thanks, Sarah has posted that as well. So yeah, follow us on Twitter and tweet, about this talk today. And yeah, so thanks so much and see you soon some other time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.